What would you do if someone told you that you didn't belong in a seat you paid for simply because of the way you look? Now imagine standing in first class, holding a valid boarding pass, while strangers whisper that you're a threat, a mistake, a security risk. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Nadine Langford, a soft-spoken, powerful black woman with quiet eyes and a voice that could command boardrooms. She boarded Flight 627 for what should have been an ordinary trip. But, within minutes, she was surrounded by prejudice, dismissed by the crew, and publicly humiliated by a family who believed they were more entitled to her seat. What they didn't know, that Nadine wasn't just a passenger. She owned the airline. What happened next changed the aviation industry forever. Was her silence a sign of weakness or the beginning of a revolution? Stay with us. This story will shift the way you see power, justice, and belonging. Like, share, and subscribe if you're ready for the full journey. Let's begin. The hum of jet engines and the soft thud of carry-on sliding into overhead bins echoed through Gate 18B. Dr. Nadine Langford adjusted the strap on her black leather satchel and stepped forward when her boarding group was called. First class, Group 1. She moved with a grace that didn't ask for attention but seemed to attract it anyway. She wore a slate gray pantsuit with subtle pinstripes, the tailoring crisp and intentional. A pearl pin rested just below her left collarbone, a quiet nod to her mother. Her hair, styled into a smooth chignon, revealed silver threads that had begun to claim space without apology. In her left hand was a boarding pass that read SIAT 1A. The gate agent gave her a clipped smile and scanned the pass. No greeting, no enjoy your flight. Nadine noticed it but said nothing. She'd learned long ago to catalog small slights without letting them anchor her spirit. Stepping into the jet bridge, she inhaled deeply. The transition from terminal chaos to aircraft quiet always brought a sense of stillness. But today, it felt different, heavier. She couldn't place it just yet. As she entered the cabin, the first-class section was already half full. Leather seats gleamed beneath dimmed lights. Champagne flutes clinked softly. Laughter rolled out from the aisle like a warm fog. Nadine paused for a moment and then turned left toward the front row. Toward 1A. But someone was already there. A tall white man in his 50s lounged in the window seat. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back in the manner of someone who thought confidence and arrogance were twins. Next to him sat a woman with elegant posture and a stiff smile. Designer sunglasses rested on her head like a crown, and a Louis Vuitton travel bag occupied the footwell under Nadine's assigned seat. The man barely glanced at her. The woman didn't look up at all. "Excuse me," Nadine said, her voice steady but soft. She held up her boarding pass. "I believe this is my seat." The man raised an eyebrow, then tilted his head. "You must be confused. This is 1A and 1B. We've had these seats booked for weeks." Nadine nodded slowly, then extended her boarding pass slightly toward him. "Yes, that's correct. I'm in 1A. He didn't take the pass, just looked at her the way someone might look at an unexpected detour sign. "Ma'am," came a voice behind Nadine, tight and overly bright. "Is there a problem?" A flight attendant, blonde hair wound into a flawless bun, stepped forward. Her name tag read Heather. Her smile was there, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No problem," Nadine said. "Just a mix-up with seating." Heather turned to the man in 1A and nodded to him with the kind of warm familiarity that comes from shared assumptions. "And you're Mr. Marsh, correct? That's right. He said, Greg Marsh. My wife Denise and I always fly first class with Silverhawk Airlines. Something must have glitched in the system. Heather turned back to Nadine, and her smile thinned. Would you mind showing me your boarding pass? Please, Nadine handed it over. Heather examined it like it might contain a riddle. Checked the seat number, the date, turned it over, held it to the light. She said softly, then looked at Nadine again. Sometimes our system double assigns seats. Happens more than you'd think. If you'd like, we can offer you a premium economy seat and a complimentary beverage. A pause. Nadine didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. I'd prefer the seat I paid for, she said, evenly. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A teenager 2 rows back stopped tapping on her phone and looked up. Heather's smile faltered. Well, Dr. Langford, she said, glancing down at the name on the boarding pass. If you could just wait a moment, I'll speak with the gate. But Nadine saw what she hadn't done. Heather hadn't asked the Marshes for their boarding passes, hadn't verified anything on their end. She had accepted their word without hesitation. Gregory Marsh leaned back, arms crossed. His wife Denise took out a paperback novel like the matter was already settled. A man in 3B muttered something about delays and people always trying to sit where they don't belong. Nadine heard it. She cataloged it. Her shoulders remained squared. As Heather walked away, Nadine took a step back into the aisle. She could feel eyes on her, not all of them hostile, some curious, some hesitant, but none intervening. The air in the cabin had shifted. She had become the disruption, the anomaly, the question mark. She thought of her foundation's motto, access, equity, dignity. It had sounded bold on paper, powerful in speeches, but here, in row 1 of a metal tube bound for D, C, she felt its fragility, felt the way dignity could be bartered down with a tight smile and a shrug. Heather returned, flanked now by a second flight attendant, a younger woman with nervous energy and dark curls tucked into a bun. I spoke with the gate, Heather said, her voice still cloyingly pleasant. They confirmed your boarding, but as a courtesy to avoid further disruption, we'd like to reassign you to a seat just a few rows back. Courtesy, Nadine repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that what this is? Another silence, this time heavier. The young woman with the dark curls looked away. Heather's professional mask cracked just slightly. Ma'am, we're trying to make this as smooth as possible for all our passengers. Nadine didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the cabin again. Greg Marsh had his AirPods in now, pretending to scroll something important. Denise sipped her champagne. Passengers avoided her gaze. A girl in 4C bit her lip and stared at her hands, and Nadine thought about every time she'd watched someone be told subtly, politely, carefully that they didn't belong. She breathed in slowly. I understand, she said finally. She stepped back, but she didn't walk toward economy. Instead, she reached for her phone. Nadine didn't move, not yet. The phone remained in her hand, the screen still dark. She hadn't unlocked it, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she was weighing it. That moment, that choice. There was a quiet strength and restraint in watching, in letting others show who they really were before you showed them who you are. Heather stood by, waiting for her to comply, expecting compliance, really. She was already turning toward the galley, Her job done. Reassure the people who looked like they belonged, remove the anomaly, return to service. But Nadine wasn't quite ready to disappear. She looked down at the small rectangle of paper still pinched between her fingers. Seat 1A. Her name printed clear across the top. No errors. No doubt. She didn't need to prove anything, and yet the burden of proving her legitimacy had been dropped at her feet like a piece of luggage no one wanted to claim. Denise Marsh didn't look up again. She had returned to her book, page perfectly creased, eyes deliberately elsewhere. Gregory pretended to be on a call now, muttering something about stocks, something about a meeting in Georgetown, anything to avoid acknowledging the black woman who had dared to disturb his peace. Across the aisle, a young mother bounced a fussy toddler on her knee. She had seen the entire exchange, Nadine could tell, but her face remained neutral, practiced in the art of not getting involved. The engine hum outside vibrated lightly through the floor, a subtle reminder that time was passing, that the door would soon close, that this flight, like most moments of injustice, would carry on unless someone stopped it. Maddie Chen sat in seat 4C, hands resting awkwardly on her thighs. She had earbuds in, but they weren't playing anything. Her phone screen was black. She watched Nadine the way a person watches a fallen glass of water, helplessly, knowing what's coming, not knowing if it's her place to stop it. Nadine noticed her, noted her silence, and understood it, too young to speak, too wise not to see. Heather returned again, this time with a clipboard and a forced laugh. Dr. Langford, I just wanted to explain that the system sometimes auto-cancels when there's a code mismatch. It's very common, probably linked to the booking class, and it's nothing personal. We'll file a customer care report for you once we're in the air. Nadine gave her a slow nod, not of agreement, of recognition, nothing personal. She had heard those words before, at the bank, at the hotel check-in desk, in board meetings when someone questioned her presence before she opened her mouth. It's nothing personal was the universal translator for you're not what we expected, and that unsettles us. I see, Nadine said calmly. She returned her boarding pass to her purse, then placed her phone on the small table attached to the bulkhead wall. Her hand hovered above it for a second. Just a second. Heather tried again. If you'd like, I can show you to a seat in row 7. Still premium. Extra leg room. Very quiet section. It's honestly one of my favorites. Nadine turned toward her, her face unreadable. You haven't asked the Marshes to show their boarding passes. Heather blinked. Well, they're on the manifest. We have them listed. So am I. Nadine replied. There was no venom in her voice, just something cooler, sharper, the calm clarity of someone used to being underestimated. Heather shifted slightly. The clipboard felt heavier in her hands now. She looked to her colleague, who offered no help, then back to Nadine. We're just trying to keep things from escalating. There it was. The thing they always said when they wanted the black woman to shrink herself for the comfort of others. Nadine tilted her head slightly, examining Heather not as an adversary but as a symptom. Escalation begins, she said slowly, when assumptions are treated as facts. Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. Somewhere near row 5, a man muttered loud enough for others to hear. This is ridiculous. We're going to be late because some lady wants to play protest. Laughter followed, 2 short bursts, not from humor, but from discomfort needing a release. Gregory Marsh smirked. He didn't turn around, but Nadine could see his satisfaction in the subtle raise of his shoulders. The power of passive victory. Ben Marsh, their 12-year-old son, leaned into the aisle from row 2. He was clearly enjoying the show. Why doesn't she just sit where they tell her, he whispered loudly. His sister, Sophie, glanced at Nadine, her expression more complex. Not kindness exactly, but something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. Then she turned away. Nadine felt something tighten in her chest, a memory rising, something old and familiar. She was 8, seated at the front of a school bus in Michigan, watching a white boy tell the bus driver she'd taken his seat. The driver hadn't asked questions. She'd just told Nadine to get up. Her mother had told her later. Some people see the seat before they see the person. That's why you walk like you own the road, baby, because one day you will. And Nadine had. She had built her path with quiet thunder, climbed every rung without waiting for applause. She didn't raise her voice because she knew the power of silence wrapped in truth. But this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong in the seat they worked for, paid for, bled for. Heather shifted again. Dr. Langford, we really need to begin taxiing. If you won't move voluntarily. She didn't finish the sentence, because that's when Nadine did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of surrender. It was the kind of smile that signaled the game had changed, that something quiet was now awakening. She picked up her phone, unlocked it with her thumb, and scrolled to a contact labeled Olivia, Ops HQ. She didn't press call, not yet. She looked once more around the cabin, at the passengers who refused to meet her eyes, at the ones pretending not to listen, at the ones waiting for her to back down so the story could end. Then she looked at Heather. I'm giving you a chance, she said quietly, to make this right before it becomes something far larger than you can imagine. Heather hesitated, her professionalism faltering. Are you threatening me? No, Nadine said simply. I'm informing you. She tapped the screen. Olivia answered on the second ring. Nadine, what's wrong? Code Indigo, Nadine said calmly. Flight 627, cabin crew incident, passenger escalation due to racial profiling. I want the aircraft grounded. There was a silence on the line. Then Olivia's voice hardened. Understood. I'll contact the flight ops manager and legal immediately. Expect gate return in less than 5. Nadine ended the call, turned her phone face down on the tray table, and folded her hands gently in her lap. Then she looked forward, straight ahead, as if nothing had happened, but something had. Everything had. The cabin had gone unusually still. It wasn't silence in the restful sense. It was a hush, thick with tension. The kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace but rather presses down on everything like static in the air before a summer storm. Nadine Langford didn't move. She sat with her back straight, hands folded, phone resting silently in front of her. She wasn't doing anything unusual, wasn't raising her voice, wasn't making demands, and yet she had become the gravitational center of the entire aircraft. The other passengers felt it. In row 3, a businessman in a tan blazer glanced at her, then looked quickly away, pretending to read a financial magazine he hadn't turned a page of in 10 minutes. Across the aisle, a woman wearing yoga pants and pearl earrings opened a snack bar and began chewing in the exaggerated way people do when trying not to comment. The act of pretending that everything was normal became a performance in itself. Then the whispers began, just one at first. A man with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses leaned toward his wife. "I don't know what she's trying to prove." The wife, lips pursed, gave a small shake of the head. "Some people just want to cause trouble." It was spoken quietly, with that signature tone of social self-justification. But the sound carried further than they realized. Whispers in airplanes often do. Confined space has a way of amplifying the things people hope will remain unheard. Nadine heard them. She didn't react. Years of practice had taught her how to sit still while the world tried to turn her into a spectacle. Her grandmother had once said, "Sometimes the loudest resistance is saying nothing at all." In seat 4C. Maddie Chen kept glancing up from her lap, where her hands rested motionless. She hadn't taken her earbuds out yet, but she also hadn't played any music. Her face held a mix of uncertainty and guilt. The way young people sometimes look when they know something is wrong but are waiting for someone older to confirm it before they act. She looked around at the adults. No one else moved. She didn't either. A few rows back, someone said it louder. "Bet she just bought a basic ticket and is trying to bluff her way into first." That one landed harder. People nodded. It gave others permission to say what they were thinking. A man chuckled from 6A. "I mean, come on. If she really belonged up here, she wouldn't be causing a scene." A woman added from behind him, "Exactly. I'm sure she's just some influencer type trying to make a viral video or something." Heather Dixon stood in the galley, arms folded. She hadn't made another announcement, but her body language said enough. She'd resumed her duties. She had chosen her side. As far as she was concerned, the issue had been contained. Nadine's phone hadn't buzzed again. Not yet. She knew Olivia was moving behind the scenes. She knew this process would take a few more minutes to reach the cockpit. She just had to hold her ground until then. Gregory Marsh leaned toward his wife and said something in a low voice that made Denise smile. Denise looked up at Nadine with a half-smile of her own, the kind that feigned sympathy but dripped with condescension. "This is really all so unfortunate," she said, her tone sweet as syrup. "If you'd just agreed to move, we'd already be in the air." Nadine turned to her. Slowly, "I did agree to move. I just didn't agree to be moved." Denise blinked. "I'm not sure I understand." "I didn't come here to disrupt anyone," Nadine said softly. "I came here to fly, like everyone else." "Then why make this so difficult?" Denise asked. "You're holding up the flight. I'm not the one in the wrong seat," Nadine replied. That simple truth hung between them like a stone suspended midair. Denise's mouth twitched. She turned away. From the window seat in row 5, Mr. Elijah Reams hadn't said a word. He sat with his hands on his knees, fingers curled tightly inward, watching the clouds through the glass. A navy blue hat rested on his lap. He was maybe in his 70s, with soft eyes and deep lines carved across his cheeks like topography. Nadine glanced at him once. Their eyes met for less than a second, but it was enough. She saw it there. Recognition, not of her name or face, but of the moment, of the weariness, of the shame that wasn't hers, but had been handed to her anyway. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. The silence said everything. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, a signal that the flight crew was preparing for final checks. Only, they weren't going anywhere. Not yet, because 30,000 feet in the air was no place for denial to go unnoticed. And Nadine knew that something had already shifted. Not for everyone, but somewhere Deep in the cabin's undercurrent, the perception had cracked. A ripple, a flicker of realization in the face of their assumptions. The young woman in row 7 pulled out her phone and scrolled through her feed, then paused. She glanced up, hesitated, then began filming quietly. No words, just the image of Nadine sitting calmly, the marshes beside her, and the tension sitting heavy in the air like smoke. Gregory noticed and hissed toward Heather. "You need to tell that girl to stop recording. This is a privacy issue." Heather came forward again, nervous now. "Ma'am," she said to the girl filming passengers is not permitted during boarding. "It's for my safety," the girl replied. "In case anything happens. You never know these days." Heather opened her mouth to argue but froze. She realized what had just happened. The shift. This wasn't just an awkward seating dispute anymore. The air had changed again. Heather turned to Nadine. "I think we should de-escalate this. Dr. Langford." Nadine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now I'm Dr. Langford again." Heather's cheeks flushed. "I didn't mean I know what you meant. It wasn't angry. It was worse. It was precise." And just then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing a minor technical delay and will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The cabin groaned in unison. A man from row 2 slapped his newspaper against his knee. "You've got to be kidding me," another voice said. "I knew something was off the moment she stepped on," Denise Marsh whispered. "She must have made a call." Gregory's eyes narrowed. "They're not going to let her pull this stunt. Watch." But Heather was already moving. Quick footsteps. Her radio crackled. The door wasn't even open yet, but something was happening. Passengers leaned toward the aisle, craning to see, and Nadine. She sat still, her breath slow, her spine tall, and for the first time in 20 minutes, a quiet smile returned to her face. She didn't need to speak yet, because the plane was already turning around. The aircraft began its slow taxi back toward the gate. Passengers who had once shifted in discomfort now leaned forward with open irritation. The delay was real now. It was no longer theoretical, no longer a possibility clouded in politeness or policy. It was here, and they knew who they were blaming for it. Dr. Nadine Langford didn't flinch under their stares. She sat still, unmoved in seat 1A, legs crossed at the ankle, hands calmly placed on her lap. The cabin had become a theater of discomfort, and Nadine was cast as both the antagonist and the catalyst depending on which row you were sitting in. Voices murmured behind her like a broken stream of static. "What's she trying to prove? I don't care who she thinks she is. We have connections in D.C. We're going to miss our dinner." Denise Marsh, in seat 1B, sighed loudly, the dramatic kind of sigh that demanded a response. "This is why we don't fly domestic anymore," she whispered toward her husband. Gregory leaned forward in his seat, placing his elbows on his knees. He wasn't whispering now. "She's obviously doing this for attention, just a stunt, some political thing." Nadine turned toward him. Finally, she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Gregory recoiled slightly under the weight of her gaze, not because it was angry, but because it was calm, unshaken. A calm he couldn't understand, couldn't access, and therefore found threatening. Heather Dixon paced in the galley, speaking softly into her radio headset. Her tone had changed. It wasn't the firm condescending professionalism from earlier. Now it was tight, unsure. Her eyes flicked to Nadine every few seconds, as if trying to calculate what was about to happen. Nadine's phone sat quietly on her tray. The call had been made. The machinery behind the scenes was moving now. Olivia Reese didn't need reminders. Once activated, Code Indigo meant corporate legal, PR, and compliance were all on alert. There would be documentation, review, action, and Nadine still hadn't revealed who she was. She could have. She could have pulled out her black titanium identification badge, embossed with the crest of the Board of Aviation Equity. She could have spoken the name of the company she chaired, or rattled off her stock percentage in Silverhawk Airlines. She could have simply said, "Google me." But she hadn't. She was waiting, not for permission, for clarity, for truth to fully reveal itself in every gesture, every word, every assumption made by the people around her. That kind of truth had a longer shelf life than outrage. In row 4, Maddie Chen sat with her arms crossed. She hadn't looked away from Nadine in 10 minutes. Not because she wanted to stare, but because she didn't want to forget. It felt wrong to pretend nothing had happened, but it also felt wrong to speak. The conflict churned in her chest. She had seen moments like this online videos of injustice caught on cell phones, shared 1,000,000 times, but this was the first time she'd lived inside the moment, and her silence clung to her skin like a confession. Mr. Elijah Reams, in seat 5A, remained still, his hands folded over the brim of his navy hat. His eyes weren't on Nadine. They were on the window, watching the tarmac roll beneath them as the plane crept back toward the gate. He had been on planes like this in the 60s, in waiting rooms like this, at counters where Sir always felt like a dare. The feeling hadn't changed much, only the language had. He said nothing, but he knew exactly what was happening. So did Nadine. She could hear her mother's voice again, faint but firm. "Baby, the world will try to shrink you, make you explain yourself before you've said a word. Don't let them make your worth a question mark. Walk like you've already answered it." She used to believe that power came from correction, from revealing your title, your salary, your education. But she had learned something else in recent years. There was greater power in letting people show you who they are before you show them who you are. People reveal their truth more quickly in the presence of what they think is weakness. She was letting them speak freely, not out of pride, but out of purpose. Let them dig the hole a little deeper. Let the cameras roll. Let the assumptions stack. They'd weigh more when they came crashing down. Heather approached again, her voice pitched for performance. "Dr. Langford, I've spoken with the captain. We're returning to the gate to verify boarding discrepancies. Once we're there, we'll get everything sorted. Thank you for your patience." Nadine tilted her head slightly. Her voice came out gentle, but deliberate. "Do you verify everyone this thoroughly, Heather? Or just the ones you can't picture in first class?" Heather blinked, caught mid-stride. For a moment, it looked like she might respond honestly. But she caught herself, lips curling into the familiar shape of corporate control. "I assure you, we treat all passengers with the same standard." Nadine offered her a patient smile. "That's the problem, isn't it? That your standard still leaves room for assumptions?" Heather stepped back. Gregory leaned over, speaking louder now. "This is harassment. My wife and I are being harassed by this woman. If this flight gets canceled because of her, "We'll sue," Denise added. "She was offered a seat. She refused. Now she's playing victim." Unbelievable. A voice from row 6 called out, "Can someone just remove her already? We have a connection in Atlanta." More murmurs, more resentment. The temperature of the cabin rising not from heat, but from the slow boil of entitlement interrupted. Nadine turned back to her tray, picked up a napkin, and quietly began folding it. One crease, then another. The act looked mundane, almost meditative, but inside her, something was solidifying. She was not here to punish. She was here to reveal. The seatbelt sign chimed again as the plane reached its new position near the terminal. The engines powered down slightly, and the light inside the cabin shifted as a jet bridge arm began aligning. The door would open soon. She could hear it in the steps of approaching ground crew. The moment was coming, and still, she didn't move, didn't announce, didn't assert, not yet, because what needed to be revealed hadn't fully surfaced. She had learned to wait for the full rot before pulling back the curtain. Only then would the truth carry enough weight to create something real in its place. Heather returned again, this time flanked by another crew member, an older man with clipped hair and a badge clipped to his blazer, a supervisor. He approached Nadine with a smile that tried to be warm. "Dr. Langford. I'm Ronald, Operations Supervisor. I've been briefed that there's some confusion. We're just going to take a moment to clarify everything with the gate and with flight services. Shouldn't take long." She looked at him. "Thank you, Ronald." He nodded, hesitated, then gestured toward the cockpit. The captain had exited and was walking toward them now. Captain Joel Anders, 50-something, clean-shaven, square-jawed. He didn't look like someone used to being questioned. He stopped in front of Nadine. "Ma'am, I've been made aware there may have been a seating error. I'm going to ask you to wait here while we confirm your boarding details with HQ." Heather, just behind him, looked triumphant. But then the captain's earpiece crackled. He touched it, paused. His face shifted, just slightly. He looked back at Nadine. She met his eyes. No fear, no pleading, just stillness. He touched his earpiece again, then turned back toward the cockpit without another word. The first domino had fallen, and still, Nadine hadn't said who she was, because she didn't have to. The truth was already landing. The captain disappeared into the cockpit without another word. It was a subtle gesture, but powerful in implication. His silence was not emptiness. It was avoidance, calculation, and retreat all at once. He had received new information, and, by the look on his face, it had shifted something. Still, no apology, no acknowledgement. Dr. Nadine Langford had expected nothing more. She watched him go with a quiet that had grown sharper, more purposeful. The napkin she had been folding now sat in her hand like a finished thought. She placed it gently on the tray table, perfectly creased. Around her, the cabin grew louder. Passengers stirred in their seats. The previous hush, taut and uncertain, now turned into a new energy. Restlessness, frustration, groupthink. The man in seat 3C, a stocky type in his 40s with a Bluetooth headset still clipped to one ear, stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he announced, though no one had asked. "We're 25 minutes behind. And all because of this woman." He gestured toward Nadine with a tilt of his head, as if she were a disturbance rather than a person. Someone behind him agreed. "It's always something these days. Always some social justice nonsense holding the rest of us hostage. Another voice chimed in, "This is why we need stricter ID checks. You let anyone claim first class, and this is what happens." The words were sharp, coated in plausible deniability. No one said black, no one said race, but everyone knew. Gregory Marsh leaned back in his seat with a triumphant kind of calm. Finally, someone said it. Heather stood near the galley, unsure whether to intervene. She scanned the rows, searching for support that wouldn't come. The mob mentality was taking root, not as a wave but as a rising tide, slow, steady, undeniable. And like tides, it didn't need facts, it needed friction. Denise Marsh joined in now, turning to Nadine with faux grace. "You're putting everyone at risk of missing their connections. People have plans, commitments. This flight isn't just about you." Nadine raised her eyes slowly. "No," she said, "it's not." Denise blinked. The answer confused her. Nadine didn't elaborate, didn't explain. She just let the weight of her words settle like dust after a storm. Because it wasn't about her. It was about the system that had made room for this kind of collective contempt. About the way injustice wrapped itself in inconvenience and weaponized politeness to silence protest. From row 6, a man stood up. He was tall, with an expensive watch and the kind of loud presence that always assumed it belonged. "I want security to remove her. This is a safety issue now." Agreed. Someone else said, "She's refusing orders. That's a flight violation. She could be anyone. What if the ticket's fake? What if the card's stolen?" Each new sentence stripped Nadine of identity and replaced her with a risk profile. Not a person, but a possibility. A danger. A disruption. She sat still through it all. Her heart beat slowly, heavily in her chest. She glanced over at Maddie Chen. The teenager's eyes were wide now, hands clenched in her lap. She looked stricken, almost ashamed, but still, she didn't speak. Nadine didn't blame her. It took years to unlearn the fear of being the first voice in a crowd of silence. Years to understand that truth doesn't wait for permission to be heard. From row 5, Mr. Elijah Reams finally shifted. He uncrossed his arms, leaned slightly into the aisle. His eyes were locked on Heather. "You going to let them talk like this?" he said softly. Heather turned to him, caught off guard. "Sir, you heard them," he said. "You heard what they said. You going to let it stand?" Heather's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I was on a flight like this once in 1982, Reams said. Same situation, different clothes, different language, same assumption." Heather swallowed hard. "You need to do better." He finished. He leaned back in his seat, silence rewrapping itself around him. Maddie shifted suddenly, pulling out her phone. Her hands shook slightly. She started recording. The lens aimed low, not invasive, just observant. She angled it toward the aisle, where tension swirled like heat off summer pavement. Gregory noticed and leaned toward her. "You can't film people like that. It's against FAA rules." Maddie looked up. "I'm documenting a public incident for my own safety," she said clearly. Denise turned toward Heather. "Are you seriously going to allow this kid's recording our family without consent? You need to get control of your cabin." But Heather had gone pale. Something in her had begun to shift. Guilt, maybe, or realization. Her authority was no longer just in question. It was unraveling. And Nadine sat still, letting it happen. not because she wanted chaos, but because the truth was best seen under pressure. People exposed themselves when they thought the crowd was on their side. The seatbelt sign chimed again. The jet bridge reattached with a low mechanical rumble. The door was opening. The moment had come. The passengers didn't know yet, but something irreversible was in motion. The systems that governed airline operations, corporate risk, and legal liability had already begun to hum behind the curtain. Olivia Reese would have looped in the board. The airline's diversity and compliance officer, crisis comms, legal, the FAA liaison, security would arrive, but not for Nadine. And when they did, there would be no yelling, no spectacle, just exposure. But even now, in the final minutes of illusion, Gregory Marsh puffed up. "I've had enough," he said loudly. "Either this woman is removed, or I will personally file a complaint with federal aviation authorities. This is a failure of protocol." "You're right," Nadine said finally. He froze. "What you should file the complaint," she said calmly. "Just make sure you spell my name correctly." Gregory faltered, confused. Nadine turned back toward the cockpit, her tone even, "Because everything you've said is about to become part of a formal report." The door opened. 2 uniformed airport officers entered, flanked by a woman in a tailored gray suit and a high-security badge on her blazer. She scanned the cabin with cool, professional urgency, then moved directly to Nadine. The woman bowed slightly. "Dr. Langford, we're ready when you are." And, just like that, the noise collapsed, the mood in the cabin turned. Visibly, audibly, tangibly, the same mouths that had doubted her now gaped in recognition. The same eyes that had judged her scrambled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had assumed. Heather's face drained of all color. Denise's jaw went slack. Gregory sat frozen. Nadine stood. Her posture hadn't changed, but everything else had. The cabin wasn't heavy anymore. It was hollow, as if the air had been sucked out, leaving only shame behind. And Nadine didn't smile, because it wasn't over. It was only beginning. A quiet settled over the cabin, but it was the kind that hummed beneath the surface like tension before thunder. The passengers had no words now, only questions. Who is she? What just happened? Why did security? Bo? Doctor? Nadine Langford didn't rush. She stood slowly, with the same calm she'd carried since the moment she boarded. Her fingers brushed the lapel of her blazer. Her chin remained lifted, her body aligned with purpose. She didn't glance at the marshes. She didn't need to. Gregory was staring at the floor, his face flushed red but silent. Denise blinked at the overhead panel as if trying to wake from a dream she didn't understand. Even Heather, still near the galley, stood frozen. Her voice, once so practiced, had vanished entirely. "Dr. Langford," said the woman in the gray blazer again, this time just above a whisper. "We've arranged a private holding room near the tarmac for your statement. Media teams are being held off until you're ready." Nadine nodded. "Thank you. Veronica." The name struck the cabin like a dropped plate. Veronica Hill, airport director. Passengers around them stiffened, the puzzle pieces finally shifting into place. This wasn't just some upper-tier frequent flyer. This wasn't someone who called in a favor. This woman, the one they had whispered about, doubted, mocked, was operating at a level none of them could touch. Veronica stepped aside to let Nadine through. But Nadine paused. Her gaze swept the cabin one more time. She didn't say a word yet. Not to the crowd, not to the people who had called her a fraud, not to the ones who had said, These people always cause problems, not even to the ones who had stayed quiet, eyes down, afraid to speak. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her pocket and retrieved her phone. She didn't bother with small talk. Just pressed the number 1 on her speed dial. It rang once. Then Olivia picked up. "Go," she said immediately. "Hold the board call until I finish here," Nadine said, her voice composed. "But initiate press notification and legal engagement now. I want Civil Rights Counsel brought into the loop, and I want compliance to pull passenger audio from the cabin. All of it. Understood." And Olivia. "Yes, ma'am, we're no longer talking containment, we're talking reform." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Olivia said, "Copy that. You want to escalate to Indigo full." Nadine's voice sharpened slightly. "Full protocol. This flight just became the defining case study for our industry." She ended the call and returned the phone to her jacket pocket. Maddie Chen was still filming, hands trembling slightly but camera steady. Nadine's eyes met hers. "Thank you for not looking away," Nadine said quietly. Maddie lowered the phone. "I didn't know what to do." "You did enough," Nadine replied. "You saw me. That's more than most." And then she turned to Elijah Reams. The older man had risen to his feet now, hat in hand, posture rigid but respectful. He offered her a small nod. "I knew someone like you would come along eventually," he said. "I just didn't think I'd live to see it." Nadine placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to wait this long." She turned toward the front, but as she stepped forward, Denise Marsh stood abruptly. "Wait, just wait a second," she stammered. "We didn't know who you were. If we had," Nadine stopped. She didn't speak right away. Denise's voice cracked with an emotion that sounded like regret, but Nadine couldn't be sure. It was too close to panic, too reactive. Gregory stood too, his hands raised as if to slow time. "This whole thing has been a misunderstanding, a mistake." "We didn't mean." Nadine raised one hand, and the room stilled again. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "You didn't treat me poorly because you didn't know who I was. You treated me poorly because you assumed I was no one." She let it settle. The kind of sentence that didn't ask for reaction. It demanded reflection. "You gave the benefit of the doubt to yourselves, to each other, to people who looked like you. But you gave me suspicion, containment, removal." Gregory's lips parted as if to argue, but there were no words left that could hold weight. Heather took a shaky breath, then stepped forward. "Dr. Langford," she began. I never intended." Nadine turned toward her. "No one intends harm, but harm doesn't wait for intention." Heather's shoulders sank. "This flight," Nadine continued, "was a test, not of me, of all of you, and it revealed exactly what it needed to." She looked back toward her seat. The leather gleamed under the overhead light, still unoccupied, still marked 1A. She hadn't been allowed to sit there, but somehow the entire flight had revolved around that seat. "I'll be filing a formal statement," Nadine said, now addressing the entire cabin. "This will go to the Federal Aviation Administration, the airline's executive board, and the national press. Every person in this cabin is part of that record." Passengers shifted, murmurs rising again like a low tide of fear. Veronica gestured again toward the exit. This time, Nadine moved. Each step toward the door echoed across the plane's hard floor. The air was different now, not thick with judgment, but with realization. The slow burn of consequence beginning to surface. As she reached the open door, she paused once more and turned back. To anyone who stayed silent, she said, voice soft, "I understand. Speaking up is hard. It makes you a target. But remember this, your silence didn't protect me. And one day, it won't protect you either." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a mechanical click, and the cabin, once so confident in its collective conviction, now felt like a room full of open hands and no excuses. Inside the jet bridge, Veronica Hill walked beside Nadine and measured strides. "We'll bring your car to the tarmac entrance," Veronica said. "Media's waiting behind the press line. Security's tight." "Thank you," Nadine said. "I'll give a statement in 48 hours. I want the footage and audio reviewed first. No spin, just facts." Veronica nodded. They reached the bottom of the ramp. A black town car idled quietly at the curb, rear door open. But Nadine turned before getting in. She looked up at the aircraft still parked, still grounded. She thought of the thousands of people who would board similar flights tomorrow, the people who would be watched, questioned, doubted, just like she had. The ones without the power to call in a grounding, without a voice that could halt an entire system. And she made a decision. One that would not just impact this flight, but every flight. One that would ground more than just a plane. Captain Joel Anders stood in the cockpit, headset half lowered, eyes fixed on the panel in front of him, though he wasn't reading any of it. His mind wasn't on flight diagnostics or weather updates. It was on the name he had just heard over the internal radio. Nadine Langford. It sounded familiar, not just in the way names sometimes do, but in the way that hinted at news headlines and boardroom whispers. At some point in his career, maybe during diversity training or a quarterly briefing, that name had been spoken with weight, influence, ownership. But now he remembered. Langford wasn't just a name. She was the founder of the Aquajet Equity Initiative, the architect of one of the most powerful reform movements in modern aviation. The same movement that had pressured airlines into overhauling biased passenger flagging systems. The same name attached to federal hearings and sweeping HR changes across multiple carriers. And now she was on his aircraft, in Seat 1A, or rather, the seat she'd paid for and been asked to leave. Anders leaned forward, pressing a button on the intercom to reach Heather in the galley. "Heather," he said, keeping his voice controlled, "I need a status update." There was a pause, a crackle of hesitation. "Captain, Dr. Langford has exited the aircraft with Airport Director Hill. Security escorted her." He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Any public disturbances, passengers recording." Another pause. Yes, at least 2 passengers. A young woman in 4C and an older gentleman in 5A witnessed and may have documentation. I believe they both remained calm. Anders closed his eyes. He felt the pressure building, not the kind that came from weather systems or altitude calculations, but the kind that could sink careers. PR backlash, board scrutiny, legal fallout. He pressed another switch to reach ground control. "This is Flight 627, requesting extended ground hold, awaiting corporate review before pushback." The response came quickly. "Confirmed. 627, standing by." Behind him, his first officer, a younger man named Lane, shifted in his seat. "What's going on?" Sir Anders looked at him, then away. "We may have removed the wrong passenger." Lane blinked. "What do you mean? She's not just a frequent flyer. She's the architect of industry reform. She's on multiple federal aviation boards, and she was just escorted off this plane by security because no one thought to question the people in her seat. Lane sat back slowly. Oh, that single syllable carried more weight than any turbulence ever could. Back in the cabin, the mood had soured completely. The once righteous indignation had turned to unease. The atmosphere felt contaminated now, like the truth had spilled into the aisle and no one knew how to clean it up. Maddie Chen still held her phone, but she wasn't filming anymore. She was just staring at the screen, unsure of whether she should upload what she had captured. Her hands trembled slightly as guilt sat heavy on her shoulders. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she hadn't done anything at all. Mr. Elijah Reams sat still as ever, but the lines around his eyes had deepened. He had seen this before, this pattern, the mob, the shame, the silence that always came too late. Heather Dixon had retreated back into the galley, hands clasped tightly behind her back. Her earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Her face was pale. She wasn't sure if her next flight assignment would ever come. She thought about her daughter, about rent, about all the things that had nothing to do with race or boarding passes but suddenly felt so small. Gregory and Denise Marsh sat stiffly, staring ahead, not at each other, not at anyone. Their posture no longer smug, but tense. Denise had begun biting her lip. Gregory was fidgeting with his watch, adjusting it even though it didn't need adjusting. "What happens now?" Denise whispered. "I don't know," Gregory said flatly, "but we should probably call our lawyer." The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Anders. We are currently experiencing an extended ground delay due to a documentation discrepancy that requires review. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience." It was the safest version of the truth he could tell without unraveling everything. Passengers murmured again, but no one spoke too loudly now. There was a shift in tone, less complaint, more confusion. What was really going on? And then, 20 minutes later, another presence stepped into the aircraft. It wasn't security this time. It was a woman in a red blazer with a badge clipped to her chest. Her stride was sure, not hurried, but filled with unmistakable authority. She walked directly to the front of the cabin, just behind the curtain, and spoke with Heather in hushed tones. Then she turned to address the passengers. "Good afternoon. My name is Camille Durant. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Silverhawk Airlines. Effective immediately. This aircraft will remain grounded pending a full investigation into a discrimination complaint involving cabin crew and passengers. If you are part of this flight, please remain seated while we process statements and determine next steps. You will be rebooked or compensated based on the outcome." A ripple of disbelief moved through the rows. Someone whispered, "Wait, this is really going that far?" Another voice followed, "They're grounding us for that woman." A third, "She's not just some woman. She owns part of the airline." And now, everyone knew. The whisper turned to panic for some. Gregory stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. I'll file for defamation. You have no proof of wrongdoing." Camille raised a hand. "We do, sir." Multiple passengers recorded the interaction, including the moment you declined to present your boarding pass. "This aircraft has onboard surveillance as well. You were informed of that upon boarding." Denise gasped. "We didn't say anything that wasn't true," Camille replied evenly. "Truth is not defined by volume or repetition, Mrs. Marsh, and this airline takes perception and treatment seriously, especially when it concerns a board advisor and major equity stakeholder. That sentence landed hard. In row 4C, Maddie's hands dropped into her lap. Her face burned with shame. She wanted to rewind time, to have said something sooner, to have stood up. Even a word would have made a difference. She had always thought she would know what to do in moments like this, but she hadn't. And that was something she would carry with her. Camille continued. Investigators will board momentarily. You may be asked to provide statements. Please comply respectfully. With that, she stepped back behind the curtain. The flight crew scattered quietly, like shadows avoiding a spotlight. And in the cockpit, Captain Anders removed his cap and set it on the console beside him. He wasn't sure what to say. Not to the crew, not to the passengers, and certainly not to the woman who had once tried to take her seat quietly. He had passed her in the aisle, had glanced at her boarding pass, had heard the murmurs and dismissed them, and now he was sitting at the helm of a frozen aircraft, with half the country about to find out why. A voice came through his earpiece again, this time from Silverhawk Corporate. Captain Anders, you are instructed to stand down. Await replacement crew, effective immediately. He blinked. They were grounding him too, and somewhere outside. Nadine Langford was already preparing the next steps. This wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The flight crew stood in a tight cluster behind the curtain, whispering in voices too quiet to catch. The air inside the cabin was dense, not with heat or turbulence, but with something far heavier reckoning. Passengers stared straight ahead or into their laps, pretending not to think about what they'd said, what they'd done, or what they hadn't done. Those who had scoffed now avoided each other's eyes. Those who had stayed silent now wondered if that silence had been complicity. No one dared say Dr. Nadine Langford's name out loud, but it was thick in the air, stitched into every breath. The jet bridge remained attached. The aircraft wasn't going anywhere. A cart of unopened sparkling water still sat parked near the galley, forgotten. In 1A, Nadine's seat remained unoccupied. It gleamed under the ambient lighting, clean, smooth, undisturbed, almost ceremonial in its emptiness, until the footsteps returned. Soft, steady, confident, Nadine was coming back. Murmurs began the moment her heels touched the jet bridge floor. She entered the plane not as a passenger now, but as someone returning to a scene she had chosen to leave only to ensure it was finished properly. Behind her walked Camille Durant and two uniformed FAA investigators, clipboards in hand. They didn't say anything to the cabin. Not yet. Their expressions were unreadable. Nadine walked slowly down the aisle, her face calm but unreadable. All eyes were on her, except for the Marshes. Gregory stared out the window as if it could transport him away from this moment. Denise kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, thumbs moving in small, frantic circles. Nadine stopped just before her seat. She looked at it, long and steady. Then she turned and faced the passengers. "I came here to fly," she said simply. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the cabin like a bell. "I bought my ticket. I passed security. I was escorted to this gate by your airline's concierge service. I held a first-class boarding pass with my name, issued by the very airline I helped restructure 2 years ago." She paused. "I didn't get to sit here." Her eyes moved across the rows. "You saw what happened. You heard the whispers. You watched me be told that my seat, though purchased and assigned, was somehow negotiable, that I was the disruption, not the discrimination. A ripple of discomfort passed over several passengers. They shifted in their seats, but no one interrupted. Let me be clear. The issue isn't that you didn't know who I was. The issue is that you assumed I was no one. A few heads bowed. Others stayed rigid, unsure how to reconcile the version of themselves they had just witnessed. People ask me why I fly commercial, she continued, why I don't just charter a jet or send my team, and I always say the same thing, because I need to know, I need to see what's happening, I need to understand where the policies I write are falling short. Maddie Chen, still in seat 4C, bit her lip. Her hands gripped her phone like it might disappear if she didn't hold on. I didn't speak up, Maddie whispered aloud, as if to herself. Nadine heard her. She turned gently toward her, softening. You saw, and you're still here. That's a start. Maddie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Nadine turned back to the cabin. I travel in silence on purpose, because it shows me how loud people's assumptions can be. Heather, from the galley, stepped forward. Her voice cracked before she could complete the first sentence. I didn't mean to. Nadine nodded once. Slowly, I believe that. Heather blinked in surprise. I believe you didn't mean to harm me, but harm doesn't require intention. It only requires permission. And in this cabin, permission was granted with silence. Heather's hands trembled. I should have checked their passes. I should have. You shouldn't have had to be told, Nadine said gently. Heather swallowed hard. Her eyes glistened. Camille stepped forward now, her tone clear and direct. The FAA has recorded passenger statements. Surveillance footage has been secured. Our legal team will be reaching out to specific individuals regarding the events of this flight. We are initiating a full review under Title VI compliance guidelines. Gasps rippled across the cabin. A man in row 6 immediately raised his hand. I didn't say anything racist. I just said we were going to be late. That's not a violation. Camille didn't respond. Denise Marsh stood, her voice, once clipped and precise, was now shaking. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I assumed it was just a mix-up. Nadine looked at her, not with anger, but with clarity. That's the danger. Mix-ups become patterns. Patterns become policy, and policy becomes discrimination. Gregory didn't speak. He sat with his jaw tight, arms crossed like a child facing the consequences of a prank gone wrong. Camille nodded to Nadine. The moment was hers to close. Nadine turned once more to the cabin, to the ones who whispered, to the ones who laughed, to the ones who stayed silent because it wasn't happening to them. I ask you to remember this moment. Not because it's uncomfortable, but because it's true. Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like logic, like protocol, like policy. She placed her hand gently on the armrest of 1A. Next time, when you see someone being treated unfairly, I hope you remember how it felt to watch and say nothing. I hope you find your voice. And with that, she finally sat down. In 1A, the seat she had earned, the seat she had been denied, the seat that now, after all the noise, had become more than a place to sit. It had become a declaration. A quiet hush fell over the plane. Even the engines seemed to still. Camille nodded toward the investigators. They exited quietly, ready to finalize reports, trigger lawsuits, initiate reforms. Heather returned to the galley without a word, her hands no longer steady. The Marshes sat in stunned silence, their world shifting beneath them, and Captain Joel Anders. He remained grounded, literally and figuratively, because truth had returned to the aircraft, and it had taken its seat in 1A. The cabin door closed again with a soft thud, sealing the moment in time. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. The rows of plush first-class seats no longer carried the air of exclusivity. They felt exposed. Dr. Nadine Langford sat silently in 1A, not victorious, not bitter, just present. The calm on her face was not peace, it was clarity, the kind that comes after a storm, not because the winds have died down, but because the truth has been revealed. Camille Durant remained near the galley, phone in hand, already drafting the report she knew would make its way into federal oversight within hours. Every detail had to be precise. The FAA wasn't just expecting documentation. They were expecting answers. Nadine adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, then looked out the window. No clouds, just the reflection of her own silhouette in the glass. A black woman in her mid-50s, alone in a seat that had been filled by others just hours before, who now sat not just as a passenger, but as a mirror to an industry's failure. Gregory Marsh finally broke the silence. His voice was stiff, clipped. "This has gone too far. My wife and I, we didn't intend to start anything. It was a misunderstanding. No one said anything inappropriate." Heather Dixon stepped forward from the galley, as if pulled by some invisible sense of responsibility. "Sir, with respect, you refused to show your boarding pass. That's standard protocol in disputes. You assumed the seat was yours and treated the guest assigned to it as if she didn't belong." Gregory turned sharply toward her. "I didn't think I had to prove my seat. I've flown this airline for years, and she hasn't." Heather asked, almost too quietly. Gregory's mouth opened, then closed. Denise, beside him, placed a hand on his arm. "We need to stop," she whispered. "Just stop." She looked toward Nadine, her voice shaky. "I know what we did, and I'm sorry. Truly." Nadine didn't respond right away, not because she hadn't heard, but because she was deciding what part of her deserved to answer her professionalism or her pain. She chose both. "You're not sorry for what you did," Nadine said softly. "You're sorry you were seen." Denise flinched. "I don't say that to wound you," Nadine continued, "but to offer you a truth most people are too polite to deliver. You weren't simply mistaken. You were confident in your mistake. That's what makes this different. That's what makes it dangerous." The words fell gently, but their weight was undeniable. A passenger in row 6 let out a slow breath. Another folded her arms, looking away. Heather remained by the curtain, her posture subdued. She looked like she wanted to say more, but knew this wasn't her moment. Mr. Elijah Reams, still in 5A, finally spoke. His voice had the resonance of someone who had waited a long time to speak freely. "She's right. You know, I've been watching it happen for decades. Folks thinking they're being neutral when really they're just comfortable with the way things have always worked for them." All eyes turned to him. He sat up straighter. "In 1972, I was thrown off a flight for asking a flight attendant to heat my coffee. Said I was being threatening. I had just finished active duty. Came home with medals. Still didn't matter." The silence was heavy again, but this time it carried something deeper than discomfort. It carried understanding. "It's not about her," Elijah said, nodding toward Nadine. "It's about every one of us who's ever had to shrink ourselves just to get through the day." Denise's eyes filled with tears. Nadine didn't gloat. She didn't shift in her seat or offer consolation. She stayed centered, because this wasn't her burden to soften. The reckoning had arrived, and it wasn't her job to dilute it. The intercom chimed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Anders. Due to evolving circumstances, this flight has been officially canceled. A new crew will be assigned. Further instructions will be provided at the gate." A collective groan rippled through the cabin, but it wasn't anger this time. It was resignation. Reality had landed, and no one could pretend it hadn't. Passengers began gathering their things, slowly, quietly. A man in row 3 walked past Nadine without a word, but gave her a respectful nod. Another woman placed her hand on the back of Nadine's seat gently, as if to say she was sorry without having to say it. Maddie Chen stood near the front of the line. She paused and turned. "I'd like to share my video with your team," she said quietly to Camille. Camille nodded. "We'd appreciate that." Then Maddie looked at Nadine. "I was scared," she said, "but I want to do better next time." Nadine gave her the smallest of smiles. "You already started." Maddie nodded and exited the aircraft. Behind her, Denise and Gregory walked slowly, avoiding all eye contact. Their faces were pale, their postures sunken. Heather followed them out, her steps heavy. Elijah Reams was the last to leave before Nadine. He tipped his hat to her. "Thank you for holding the line," he said. "I might not have said it while it was happening, but I felt every second of it." "You were never invisible to me," Nadine replied. He nodded once and disappeared into the jet bridge. Finally. Camille approached Nadine with a clipboard in one hand and a digital tablet in the other. "The board is waiting for your official debrief," she said, "but I can delay if you'd prefer." Nadine stood slowly, picking up her satchel and smoothing her jacket. "No, let's not delay. Let's be clear. This doesn't get handled behind closed doors. This goes to the top." Camille met her gaze. "You want a public inquiry, I want a precedent." She stepped into the aisle and paused, turning once more toward the cabin. It was empty now. The leather seats sat cold, untouched, but the echoes of voices, of judgment, of dismissal, they were still there. Nadine inhaled once, then exhaled through her nose. She didn't need the seat anymore. She had taken back something far more important. Her voice, her dignity, her purpose. And, in doing so, she had created a path for others to follow. This wasn't about personal victory. This was structural clarity. The reckoning wasn't the end. It was the reset. The private conference room was cool and quiet, lit by indirect ceiling lights that cast a soft glow on the long mahogany table. Frosted glass panels muted the outside noise, but inside, everything was still. No engine hum, no overhead announcements, no whispers from passengers. Dr. Nadine Langford sat at the head of the table. In front of her was a tablet containing preliminary notes from the flight investigation. Across from her sat Camille Durant, poised and steady, and to Nadine's right was Olivia Reese, freshly arrived from headquarters, her blazer still dusted with summer air from the tarmac. Nadine had barely touched the glass of water set beside her. She didn't need hydration. She needed truth. "I've read the initial logs," Olivia said, scrolling through the screen. "The passenger statements align with what we expected. Surveillance confirms that no boarding pass was requested from the marshes. Heather Dixon only questioned you, and documentation confirms she didn't follow internal protocol for dispute resolution." Nadine nodded. "No surprise, only confirmation," Camille added. FAA representatives have already requested a full timeline. They're assembling a civil review panel. Press inquiries are coming in hourly. And we've received a private request from a U.S. Senate subcommittee for a conversation about expanding your recommendations into federal regulation. Silence followed, not tension, a kind of reverent pause. Then Nadine leaned forward, pressing her fingers together. I don't want this reduced to an isolated incident. That's what they'll try to do, contain it in a headline. Label it unfortunate, say it's being addressed. But this wasn't isolated. It was systemic. It happened in the air, but it's rooted deep in the ground beneath us. Olivia nodded. You want to go public, I want to go purposeful. Nadine said, if we're going to speak, we speak wide, we speak high, and we speak clearly. Camille smiled faintly. That's why the board listens when you speak. No, Nadine corrected. That's why people listen when we don't speak, because they expect silence. When you break that expectation, the truth echoes. She stood, walked to the far window. Her reflection stared back, framed by the curvature of the jet parked just outside. That seat, that aisle, that moment. It hadn't broken her. It had crystallized her. She turned back to Olivia and Camille. I'm going to give a statement. Today, Camille asked. In 2 hours, Nadine confirmed. And I want it live. What message should we prepare? Nadine took a breath, and then, quietly, she began dictating. 2 hours later, in front of a backdrop bearing the Silverhawk Airlines emblem and the insignia of the Aquajet Equity Initiative. Nadine stepped up to a lectern. Reporters packed the media room. Some had flown in the moment they heard the story. Wasn't just a seating dispute. It was a civil inflection point. Olivia stood off to the side, just behind the curtain. Camille managed the press list with her usual precision. Cameras flickered, microphones adjusted, the room hushed, and Nadine began. I want to start by saying something very simple. She paused. My name is Dr. Nadine Langford. I am a mother. I am a former educator. I am the founder of Aquajet and a board advisor to Silverhawk Airlines. I hold equity shares in this company and have dedicated the last decade of my life to helping reshape how we define dignity in public spaces, especially in the air. Another pause. I was removed from my assigned seat, not because I lacked a boarding pass, not because I posed a threat, not because I violated any regulation. I was removed because a flight attendant, a couple in my row, and a group of passengers made the same assumption that I didn't belong. She looked up, and, more importantly, no one in the cabin challenged that assumption. No one stopped to ask why a black woman in a tailored suit, carrying a valid boarding pass, would be the one questioned and not the people occupying her seat. Cameras clicked. No one moved. I don't share this for sympathy. I share it for clarity. This isn't a personal grievance. It's a mirror. A mirror reflecting how unconscious bias moves through systems that claim neutrality. She inhaled slowly. This is not about revenge. No one will be ruined by this. But this is about responsibility. Because what happened to me on Flight 627 happens to people every day. And most of them don't have a title. They don't have legal counsel on speed dial. They don't have leverage. A shift rippled through the room. Journalists leaned in. Pens still. So let me be clear. This moment is not about me. It's about us. All of us. It's about who we trust to belong. It's about what happens when people stay silent, not because they are cruel, but because they are comfortable. Nadine's voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. I don't want to live in a world where a seat means more than a person, where assumptions go unchallenged because confrontation is inconvenient, where we reward courtesy over courage. Then she said the words that would be quoted in op-eds, boardrooms, and classrooms for years. You didn't treat me the way you did because you knew who I was. You treated me that way because you assumed I was no one. And that's exactly why we must change everything. She stepped back. The silence in the room held for several seconds. Then applause broke, not the obligatory kind, but the kind that rises from a place just beneath the ribs, where truth meets breath. Reporters filed out quickly, already composing headlines that would ripple across news feeds. Inside the media room, Olivia approached her. "They're calling it the Langford Doctrine already." "I didn't ask for a doctrine," Nadine replied. "I asked for decency." "And yet," Camille added, "you delivered both." Nadine walked slowly to the back hall, away from the lights, away from the flash. She passed a janitor in a green uniform who looked up at her and gave a single nod. "Thank you," he said simply. She returned it. No words necessary, because words might echo, but actions ripple, and she had just released a wave. 2 days after the press conference, Nadine Langford's words had traveled farther than any flight could. Her speech, now dubbed "the seat that sparked a standard," was being shared across social media, headlining major news networks, and dissected by anchors and panelists who had, for years, treated systemic bias as a debate topic rather than a lived reality. In airports across the country, flight crews gathered in break rooms watching clips of the incident. Some nodded quietly, others sat still, unsure how to reconcile what they were witnessing with their own practices. In classrooms, students used Nadine's quote as part of civil discourse essays. "You didn't treat me that way because you knew who I was. You treated me that way because you assumed I was no one." It had become more than a line. It had become a litmus test, a mirror, a question. Across the airline industry, the ripple had become a current. Silverhawk Airlines was the first to act. Within 72 hours of the incident, they announced a full internal audit of passenger treatment data across all domestic and international flights over the last 3 years. Disparities based on race, gender, and perceived social status would be flagged. Each case would be independently reviewed. Heather Dixon, the flight attendant at the center of the incident, formally resigned. Her letter, shared internally but leaked online, included the line, "I didn't mean harm, but that's exactly the problem. I didn't stop it either." And silence, in that moment, was harm. The Marsh family, Gregory and Denise, were placed under federal review for civil rights violations under FAA jurisdiction. Their names were not released publicly, but those who had been on the flight knew, and so did the broader public. But Nadine didn't call for punishment. She called for transformation. In a special board meeting with executives from 5 major airlines, she introduced a new framework called AIR Acknowledgement: Intervention, Reform. Acknowledgement meant owning that bias exists even when unintended. Intervention required equipping all flight and gate staff to identify and stop discriminatory behavior in real time. Reform was the long-game revising training, auditing boarding processes, and building accountability structures not just for compliance, but for culture. Camille Durant worked around the clock helping codify AIR into Silverhawk's operations. Olivia Reese coordinated rollout plans with industry unions, airline alliances, and legal partners. Other airlines, watching the public's overwhelming support for the initiative, followed. within 10 days. Horizon Air, Vantage Fly, Atlantic Northwest, and Summit Jet announced partnerships with Equijet to implement the AIR framework by the end of the quarter. At the same time, the Federal Aviation Administration held an emergency session to discuss mandatory discrimination incident reporting across all commercial flights. What used to be optional passenger behavior notes would now be logged, reviewed, and shared with oversight panels. For the first time, patterns would be visible. Accountability wouldn't wait for outrage. Nadine stayed mostly out of the spotlight during these shifts. She wasn't chasing credit, she was chasing clarity. One afternoon, she sat at her home office, scrolling through the hundreds of letters that had been sent to the Equijet office. Some were typed, some handwritten, some from teenagers, some from flight attendants. One from a retired pilot who admitted he'd once assumed a black woman in first class was a celebrity because it didn't occur to him she could be a surgeon or a CEO. They all ended the same way. Thank you. She opened one envelope that had no return address. Inside was a single photo. It was a screenshot from Maddie Chen's phone. Nadine, seated calmly in 1A, hands folded, gaze steady. Below the photo was a note written in blue pen. I used to think silence kept me safe, but that day I saw what courage looked like. Thank you for helping me find mine. Nadine sat back in her chair and let the words settle. Somewhere, in a classroom or an airport or a subway seat, a girl was watching, learning, holding her voice like a match, and that was the point. The change wasn't about airline policy alone. It was about the people who now felt seen, heard, and empowered to question what used to be accepted. Later that week, Nadine stood before a gathering of all Silverhawk staff at their Dallas headquarters. Engineers, baggage handlers, flight attendants, operations leads. Thousands of employees across departments had joined virtually. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Nadine walked to the center of the stage without notes, no podium, no screen, just presence. I'm not here to talk about what happened to me, she began. I'm here to talk about what happens next. She let that sit. You've heard the terms bias, profiling, disruption, but underneath every policy change and training module is a simple question. Do you believe every person who boards your plane deserves dignity? A murmur moved through the crowd. Not just the frequent flyers, not just the ones in tailored suits or with familiar last names. Everyone, the teacher, the janitor, the grandmother, the student with the prepaid ticket, the child flying alone, the black woman who chose not to explain herself. Nadine paused. Dignity is not a reward. It's not a privilege. It's the baseline. And from today forward, let's agree that anyone who forgets that doesn't belong in this industry. Applause began, but it wasn't thunderous. It was steady, measured, the kind of applause that said, "We hear you now. We're still learning, but we're ready." In the weeks that followed, the AIR framework became the new gold standard in aviation customer care. Equijet began collaborating with international carriers across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Nadine was invited to testify before Congress. Her recommendations were entered into the official record. New legislation was introduced that would, for the first time, tie federal funding for transportation programs to anti-discrimination policy compliance. The ripple had become a wave, and in that wave, thousands of quiet stories began to surface. Stories of mothers no longer being mistaken for nannies, students no longer being questioned for having upgraded seats, Elderly black men no longer being overlooked for pre-boarding assistance. Flight attendants intervening firmly and immediately when someone made an assumption too casually, too confidently. Nadine didn't try to hold the center of that movement. She knew better. True change wasn't top-down, it was side by side. So when people thanked her, she nodded. When asked what she wanted from all of it, she offered only this: I want the next person who boards a plane and takes their seat quietly, confidently, to feel like they're exactly where they belong. Because change doesn't start with a headline. It starts with a seat and the courage to stay in it. The airport gate buzzed with the quiet hum of travel, announcements floating in and out like waves. Concourse C at Reagan National felt oddly still, despite the foot traffic. Maybe it was the silence of recognition, maybe it was something else. Inside Gate C-18 passengers began to board Flight 627 to Denver. The same route, the same aircraft model, but today something had shifted. At the front of the line stood a young woman in a green sweater dress and black flats. She carried a small satchel over her shoulder and gripped her boarding pass a little too tightly. Her name was Karina Brooks, a junior associate at a nonprofit in D.C., flying to meet her mother for the first time in 6 years. She'd saved for this trip for 5 months. When she walked up to the gate agent, she almost whispered, Group 1, Seat 1A. The agent scanned her pass and smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks. Enjoy your flight. Karina blinked, unsure for a moment if she'd misheard, but no, the warmth was real, the tone was intentional. As she walked down the jet bridge, she felt something settle in her chest, something unfamiliar. Belonging. When she reached row 1, she stopped. A middle-aged man in a blazer stood, already moving aside. This must be your seat, he said kindly. I'm 1C. Karina smiled and nodded. No questioning glances, no request for ID, no confusion over how she got there. She sat down, looked out the window, and exhaled slowly. Up front, in the cockpit, Captain Joel Anders adjusted his headset and reviewed the flight plan. He'd flown the original Flight 627, the one that made headlines. Since then, things had changed. Protocols were stricter, bias training's mandatory, but the real change, he knew, wasn't on paper. It was in posture, in choices, in awareness. He looked down at the copy of a speech transcript folded neatly in his flight bag. Nadine Langford's words, underlined in places he still read before takeoff. She didn't raise her voice. He once told a new co-pilot. She raised the standard, at that moment, in a conference room in Atlanta. Nadine Langford was finishing a quiet conversation with a group of high school students flown in from around the country. The room had been filled with tough questions. Why didn't you just tell them who you were? Weren't you afraid they'd retaliate? How did you stay calm? She answered each with clarity and patience. Power doesn't come from making people afraid of you, she told them. It comes from knowing who you are even when others don't. A girl in the back, no older than 13, raised her hand slowly. If it happens to us, what should we do? Nadine looked at her. You decide if the moment calls for peace or for fire, she said. But whichever you choose, do it with purpose. Don't just react, respond. After the session ended, one of the student coordinators approached her. He handed her a small envelope. It came in the mail this morning, no return address. Nadine opened it carefully. Inside was a thank you card. No signature. Just a photo of a teenage girl seated in 4C on the infamous flight, Maddie Chen. She had been quiet, but not anymore. On the back of the card, in small handwriting, were 4 words. I found my voice. Nadine closed her eyes for a moment, let it wash over her. Back on flight 627, Karina Brooks sipped a ginger ale and pulled out her phone. She wasn't sure why, but she searched Nadine Langford's name. Hundreds of results, clips from her speech, panels with civil rights leaders, interviews with airline executives. And then, a headline, Langford Institute launches nationwide passenger equity initiative. The article detailed a sweeping reform package being adopted by 27 airlines. Passengers would now receive clear digital confirmation of seating at the time of boarding. Real-time logs of seating disputes would be automatically reviewed by third-party equity officers. Frontline staff were receiving recurring equity training not just once, but quarterly. Passengers who experienced bias would no longer be routed through complaint hotlines that disappeared into silence. They would be seen, heard, responded to. Karina didn't realize she'd started crying until the flight attendant passed by and gently handed her a tissue. "Everything okay?" "Ma'am," Karina nodded, wiping her cheek. "It's just nice to be seen." The attendant smiled softly. "That's what we aim for. 35,000 feet below, in a legislative chamber in D&C, the Passenger Equity and Transparency Act was being read aloud for a vote. It included provisions for nationwide flight data transparency, whistleblower protections, and automatic alerts to the Department of Transportation when discriminatory patterns were flagged. As the chamber voted, Nadine Langford's name was cited on the floor 5 separate times. None of this was her plan, but it was her purpose. Later that evening, Nadine sat in her study, her favorite jazz record playing in the background. The windows were open. A warm breeze rustled the curtains. She pulled out a worn journal and wrote, "Legacy isn't what you build for yourself. It's what others carry forward when you're not in the room." She thought of Karina Brooks, boarding her flight with quiet hope. She thought of Maddie Chen, who now ran a campus group on bias in education. She thought of Mr. Elijah Reams, who had sent a letter months after the incident, simply saying, "I stayed quiet that day, but I haven't stopped speaking since." And she thought of herself not in seat 1A or at a board table, but as a girl from Memphis who once wondered if her voice mattered. She smiled. It had, it did, it would, across the country. Passengers boarded planes, some in first class, some in the back, some old, some young, some invisible for too long. But the air was different now. There were still challenges. Still work to do, but in that atmosphere, something essential had taken flight. Awareness, empathy, justice, and legacy. Nadine closed her journal and looked out the window at the stars above the treetops. She whispered the words only she could hear. "Keep flying forward," and the wind seemed to answer. Sometimes, the most powerful act isn't raising your voice, it's choosing the exact moment to speak, with purpose. Dr. Nadine Langford didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She watched. She waited. And when she finally spoke, the world listened. What began as a moment of personal pain on an airplane seat became a spark that ignited reform, accountability, and a legacy of justice. This isn't just a story about one woman. It's a mirror. For every silent bystander, every assumption made, every gate agent, every passenger, every leader who must ask, what do I really see when I look at someone, and more importantly, what do I choose to do when I see injustice unfolding? If this story moved you even just a little, if it made you feel think, question. Then help us spread the message. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that matters, because justice doesn't come from silence, it comes from us.